Chapter 7. The Mexican War, the Battle of Palo Alto, the Battle of Resaca de La Palma, Army of Invasion, General Taylor, Movement on Camargo. While General Taylor was away with the bulk of his army, the little garrison up the river was besieged. As we lay in our tents upon the seashore, the artillery at the fort on the Rio Grande could be distinctly heard. The war had begun. You are listening this book at VolantLife Radio. There were no possible means of obtaining news from the garrison, and information from outside could not be otherwise than unfavorable. What General Taylor's feelings were during this suspense, I do not know, but for myself, a young second lieutenant who had never heard a hostile gun before, I felt sorry that I had enlisted. A great many men, when they smell battle afar off, chafe to get into the fray. When they say so themselves, they generally fail to convince their hearers that they are as anxious as they would like to make believe, and as they approach danger they become more subdued. This rule is not universal, for I have known a few men who were always aching for a fight when there was no enemy near, who were as good as their word when the battle did come. But the number of such men is small. On the 7th of May, the wagons were all loaded and General Taylor started on his return, with his army reinforced at Point Isabel, but still less than 3,000 strong, to relieve the garrison on the Rio Grande. The road from Point Isabel to Matamoros is over an open, rolling, treeless prairie until the timber that borders the bank of the Rio Grande is reached. This river, like the Mississippi, flows through a rich alluvial valley in the most meandering manner, running towards all points of the compass, at times within a few miles. Formerly, the river ran by Resaca de la Palma, some 4 or 5 miles east of the present channel. The old bed of the river at Resaca had become filled at places, leaving a succession of little lakes. The timber that had formerly grown upon both banks, and for a considerable distance out, was still standing. This timber was struck 6 or 8 miles out from the besieged garrison, at a point known as Palo Alto, tall trees or woods. Early in the forenoon of the 8th of May, as Palo Alto was approached, an army, certainly outnumbering our little force, was seen, drawn up in line of battle, just in front of the timber. Their bayonets and spearheads glistened in the sunlight formidably. The force was composed largely of cavalry armed with lances. Where we were the grass was tall, reaching nearly to the shoulders of the men, very stiff, and each stock was pointed at the top, and hard and almost as sharp as a darning needle. General Taylor halted his army before the head of column came in range of the artillery of the Mexicans. He then formed a line of battle, facing the enemy. His artillery, 2 batteries, and 2 18-pounder iron guns, drawn by oxen, were placed in position at intervals along the line. A battalion was thrown to the rear, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Childs, of the artillery, as reserves. These preparations completed, orders were given for a platoon of each company to stack arms and go to a stream off to the right of the command to fill their canteens and also those of the rest of their respective companies. When the men were all back in their places in line, the command to advance was given. As I looked down that long line of about 3,000 armed men advancing towards a larger force also armed, I thought, what a fearful responsibility General Taylor must feel, commanding such a host, and so far away from friends. The Mexicans immediately opened fire upon us, first with artillery, and then with infantry. At first their shots did not reach us, and the advance was continued. As we got nearer, the cannonballs commenced going through the ranks. They hurt no one, however, during this advance, because they would strike the ground long before they reached our line, and ricocheted through the tall grass so slowly that the men would see them and open ranks and let them pass. When we got to a point where the artillery could be used with effect, a halt was called, and the battle opened on both sides. The infantry under General Taylor was armed with flintlock muskets and paper cartridges charged with powder, buckshot, and ball. At the distance of a few hundred yards, a man might fire at you all day without your finding it out. The artillery was generally 6-pounder brass guns throwing only solid shot, but General Taylor had with him 3 or 4 12-pounder howitzers throwing shell, besides his 18-pounders before spoken of that had a long range. This made a powerful armament. The Mexicans were armed about as we were so far as their infantry was concerned, but their artillery only fired solid shot. We had greatly the advantage in this arm. The artillery was advanced a rod or two in front of the line and opened fire. The infantry stood at order arms as spectators, watching the effect of our shots upon the enemy and watching his shots so as to step out of their way. It could be seen that the 18-pounders and the howitzers did a great deal of execution. On our side there was little or no loss while we occupied this position. During the battle, Major Ringgold, an accomplished and brave artillery officer, was mortally wounded, and Lieutenant Luther, also of the artillery, was struck. During the day several advances were made, and just at dusk it became evident that the Mexicans were falling back. We again advanced and occupied at the close of the battle substantially the ground held by the enemy at the beginning. In this last move, there was a brisk fire upon our troops, and some execution was done. One cannonball passed through our ranks, not far from me. It took off the head of an enlisted man and the underjaw of Captain Page of my regiment, while the splinters from the musket of the killed soldier and his brains and bones knocked down 2 or 3 others, including one officer, Lieutenant Wallen, hurting them more or less. Our casualties for the day were 9 killed and 47 wounded. At the break of day on the 9th, the army under Taylor was ready to renew the battle, but an advance showed that the enemy had entirely left our front during the night. The chaparral before us was impenetrable, except where there were roads or trails, with occasionally clear or bare spots of small dimensions. A body of men penetrating it might easily be ambushed. It was better to have a few men caught in this way than the whole army, yet it was necessary that the garrison at the river should be relieved. To get to them, the chaparral had to be passed. Thus I assume General Taylor reasoned. He halted the army not far in advance of the ground occupied by the Mexicans the day before, and selected Captain C. F. Smith of the artillery and Captain McCall of my company to take 150 picked men each and find where the enemy had gone. This left me in command of the company, an honor and responsibility I thought very great. Smith and McCall found no obstruction in the way of their advance until they came up to the succession of ponds before described at Resaca. The Mexicans had passed them and formed their lines on the opposite bank. This position they had strengthened a little by throwing up dead trees and brush in their front and by placing artillery to cover the approaches and open places. Smith and McCall deployed on each side of the road as well as they could and engaged the enemy at long range. Word was sent back, and the advance of the whole army was at once commenced. As we came up, we were deployed in like manner. I was with the right wing and led my company through the thicket wherever a penetrable place could be found, taking advantage of any clear spot that would carry me towards the enemy. At last I got pretty close up without knowing it. The balls commenced to whistle very thick overhead, cutting the limbs of the chaparral right and left. We could not see the enemy, so I ordered my men to lie down, an order that did not have to be enforced. We kept our position until it became evident that the enemy were not firing at us, and then withdrew to find better ground to advance upon. By this time, some progress had been made on our left. A section of artillery had been captured by the cavalry, and some prisoners had been taken. The Mexicans were giving way all along the line, and many of them had, no doubt, left early. I at last found a clear space separating two ponds. There seemed to be a few men in front, and I charged upon them with my company. You are listening this book at VolantLife Radio. There was no resistance, and we captured a Mexican colonel who had been wounded and a few men. Just as I was sending them to the rear, with a guard of 2 or 3 men, a private came from the front bringing back one of our officers who had been badly wounded in advance of where I was. The ground had been charged over before. My exploit was equal to that of the soldier who boasted that he had cut off the leg of one of the enemy. When asked why he did not cut off his head, he replied, "Someone had done that before." This left no doubt in my mind but that the Battle of Resaca de la Palma would have been won, just as it was, if I had not been there. There was no further resistance. The evening of the 9th, the army was encamped on its old ground near the fort, and the garrison was relieved. The siege had lasted a number of days, but the casualties were few in number. Major Jacob Brown, of the 7th Infantry, the commanding officer, had been killed, and in his honor the fort was named. Since then a town of considerable importance has sprung up on the ground, occupied by the fort and troops, which has also taken his name.